Number 10. The Meroitic throne and the burden of sacred kingship. Some thrones became dangerous because too many ambitious men wanted them. The Meroitic throne is darker because its danger seems to have grown from a more sacred and less easily escaped source. The crushing burden of kingship itself in a world where rule was tied not only to political command, but to divine legitimacy, ritual expectation, and the weight of representing cosmic order before the living and the dead. That is what makes the case so unsettling. In kingdoms where the ruler is more than a military leader or administrator, the throne ceases to be merely a prize. It becomes an altar of responsibility, a place where failure is no longer personal. It becomes spiritual, dynastic, and civilizational all at once. A kingship shaped by that kind of sacred gravity may look magnificent from the outside, but inside it can become almost unbearable. What gave the Meroitic throne its force also made it frightening. Sacred kingship amplifies everything. It magnifies legitimacy, but it also magnifies doubt. It gives the ruler extraordinary symbolic authority, but it makes any weakness more dangerous, because the throne is expected to carry meanings larger than ordinary politics can safely contain. In such a system, succession is never simply a legal transfer. It is a test of whether the next ruler can bear a sacred role without breaking the balance around it. Priestly influence, dynastic expectation, royal ritual, and the public image of kingship can all tighten around the throne until the person who occupies it is no longer just reigning. He is being consumed by the office he represents. Power may seem greatest there, yet freedom is often at its weakest. That is what makes the Meroitic case feel so haunting. A sacred throne can destroy rulers without constant visible war because it creates a kind of pressure that never leaves the palace. The king must be more than successful. He must be symbolically right. He must rule in a way that satisfies the invisible structure holding the kingdom together. Once that structure becomes too heavy, kingship itself starts to look dangerous before any enemy attacks. The throne does not merely offer command, it demands that the ruler embodies something almost superhuman. And the more a kingdom believes that, the more frightening the throne becomes, because every failure, every uncertainty, and every transition begins to threaten not just policy, but the sacred meaning of rule itself. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadly, not because they are weak, but because they are too heavily charged with meanings no human being can carry safely forever. That is why the Meroitic throne opens this list. It represents the darker side of sacred monarchy, where the crown may elevate a ruler above ordinary men, while also trapping him inside expectations powerful enough to distort succession, intensify vulnerability, and turn kingship into a burden as dangerous as any war beyond the kingdom's borders. Number 9. The Hittite throne and the violence of court legitimacy. Some thrones become dangerous because rival kingdoms attack them from outside. The Hittite throne is darker because much of its danger seems to have come from within the political heart of the kingdom itself, where legitimacy could not remain abstract, and where court struggle had the power to turn succession into a violent contest over who had the right to embody royal order. That is what makes the case so unsettling. A throne like this does not become deadly only when enemies gather at the frontier. It becomes deadly when the palace begins generating uncertainty faster than the kingdom can contain it. Once legitimacy is unstable inside the court, every ambition grows sharper, every alliance becomes more conditional, and every claimant becomes a possible source of destruction. What gave the Hittite throne its force also made it frightening. It stood at the center of a kingdom that depended heavily on dynastic continuity, elite loyalty, diplomatic credibility, and the visible authority of the king. That means the throne could not tolerate confusion lightly. If royal legitimacy weakened, the damage spread quickly beyond the palace walls. Vassals watched more carefully. Rivals calculated more boldly. Elites inside the kingdom began asking not only who ruled, but who ought to rule. and that question is among the most dangerous any court can ask. In such a world, the throne becomes less a stable seat and more a charged point where bloodline, political support, and survival collide. Whoever sits on it may wear the crown, but the crown does not silence the voices gathering around it. That is what makes the Hittite case feel so heavy. Court legitimacy is especially frightening because it makes violence feel intimate. The struggle is not always between strangers on a battlefield. It is between figures already inside the same world of kinship, diplomacy, ritual, and royal proximity. That closeness intensifies everything. Suspicion becomes harder to escape. Rivalry becomes harder to isolate. The throne remains sacred and central, yet precisely because it is so central, every uncertainty at the top begins to poison the larger structure of rule. What looks like succession from a distance can feel like a slow, internal destabilization from within, as if the kingdom's political core is repeatedly teaching everyone around it that authority may no longer be secure. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become more dangerous than war, because war at least makes the enemy visible, while court legitimacy turns danger into something hidden, proximate, and constantly alive inside the ruling structure itself. That is why the Hittite throne takes this place on the list. It reveals how a crown can become lethal when the palace no longer agrees on who can wear it safely, and when the struggle to define rightful rule begins tearing apart the very center meant to keep the kingdom whole. Number 8. The Macedonian throne after Alexander. Some thrones become dangerous because they belong to weak kingdoms surrounded by stronger enemies. The Macedonian throne is darker because it became most lethal after being attached to one of the greatest conquerors in history. That is what makes the case so unsettling. Alexander left behind not only an empire, but a political void charged with impossible expectation. Once a throne has been enlarged by a figure of that magnitude, no ordinary succession can pass through it safely. The seat of rule stops being merely a place from which a kingdom is governed. It becomes the center of an inheritance too vast, too prestigious, and too unstable for any single claimant to possess without provoking fear, rivalry, and immediate conflict. In such a world, the throne does not wait quietly for the next ruler. It begins attracting fragmentation the moment the extraordinary ruler is gone. What gave the Macedonian throne its force also made it frightening. Alexander's conquests transformed kingship into something far larger than the old framework of Macedonia could securely contain. The throne now stood in relation to armies spread across continents, commanders with enormous ambitions, and a newly expanded political imagination in which power had become almost boundless in scale. That is a recipe for danger. Once the ruler who held all of that together disappears, the throne does not merely need an heir. It needs someone capable of making a broken unity look whole again. And when no one can do that convincingly, legitimacy becomes contested at every level. Generals weigh opportunity against loyalty. Royal kin become symbols to be used or removed. The monarchy continues to exist in name, but the seat itself becomes a magnet for calculated violence. That is what makes the Macedonian case feel so haunting. A battlefield is dangerous because men know they may die there. A throne like this is more dangerous because it promises power on a scale so immense that almost everyone near it is tempted to reshape it through force. The succession crisis is not just about who should rule Macedonia. It is about who can claim the shadow of Alexander, who can weaponize proximity to his bloodline, and who can survive long enough to make such claims matter. In this atmosphere, the throne becomes inseparable from manipulation, proxy rule, and the political use of living heirs, whose value lies precisely in how little independent safety they possess. Kingship survives, but it does so inside a field of ambition so violent that the crown often looks less like protection than exposure. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadly because greatness makes them uninhabitable after the fact. That is why the Macedonian throne after Alexander belongs here. It shows how the most dangerous inheritance is not always a weakened state, but an expanded one whose founder has made power too vast to pass on cleanly. In that sense, the throne became more lethal than war because war at least had an enemy at the front. The throne had rivals everywhere, all of them standing beneath the shadow of a dead conqueror no successor could safely replace. Number 7. The Seleucid throne and the collapse of dynastic control. Some thrones become dangerous because ambitious relatives fight over them in moments of weakness. The Seleucid throne is darker because the danger seems to have become chronic, woven into the long deterioration of dynastic control itself. That is what makes the case so unsettling. This was not simply a matter of one disputed succession or one palace coup. The Seleucid monarchy ruled a vast and unstable imperial world in which distance, regional ambition, military power, and dynastic rivalry repeatedly collided. Under such conditions, the throne could not remain a calm center for long. It was expected to hold together an empire that was already difficult to govern, and every weakness at the top multiplied the strain below. A crown in such a system does not merely confer power, it inherits instability already in motion. What gave the Seleucid throne its force also made it frightening. It stood at the center of a Hellenistic empire stretched across diverse territories, strategic frontiers, and competing political realities. To hold the throne was to claim command over an immense domain, but that same scale made the seat of rule intensely vulnerable to succession conflict, military intervention, and regional fragmentation. When dynastic authority is strong, such an empire can appear formidable. When dynastic authority weakens, the throne becomes the most dangerous point in the whole structure, because too many actors understand that the person who controls the crown controls the language of legitimacy, even if not the substance of lasting order. Once that gap opens, the dynasty begins consuming itself. Claimants arise, alliances shift, provinces drift, and the monarchy becomes both indispensable and continually endangered. That is what makes the Seleucid case feel so heavy. A collapsing dynasty does not always lose its throne immediately. Often it keeps reproducing contention around the throne long after its ability to command stable obedience has already begun to fade. That is one of the darkest forms of political danger. The crown remains worth killing for, even as it becomes less capable of protecting the one who wins it. Each accession promises restoration. Each new crisis reveals how little restoration the throne can actually deliver. The dynasty keeps generating rulers, rivals, and hopes of recovery, but the machinery of control keeps slipping. In such a setting, kingship becomes almost parasitic on itself, surviving by producing new struggles over an office that has become far more dangerous than secure. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadlier than war because war can end, while dynastic collapse keeps renewing violence from the center outward. That is why the Seleucid throne takes this place on the list. It reveals a monarchy in which legitimacy remained precious long after control became unstable, turning the crown into a repeated source of intrigue, conflict, and ruin. In that world, the throne does not merely sit inside a troubled empire. It becomes one of the main reasons the trouble never stops. Number 6. The Qin throne after unification. Some thrones become dangerous because they belong to unstable dynasties from the beginning. The Qin throne is darker because it became lethal after achieving one of the most extraordinary consolidations of power in ancient history. That is what makes the case so unsettling. This was not a weak kingship struggling to survive at the margins. It was the center of a state that had crushed rivals, standardized rule, centralized administration, and transformed the political map of China with brutal efficiency. From a distance, such a throne looks invincible. But a throne built on such concentrated authority can become terrifying the moment the founding force behind it disappears. When too much power has been compressed into one center, succession does not merely transfer control. It exposes whether the entire structure can survive without the will that created it. What gave the Qin throne its force also made it frightening. The dynasty's power depended on rigid centralization, harsh discipline, legal authority, and a political order designed to eliminate ambiguity. That made conquest possible, but it also made the throne intensely dangerous after unification, because every crisis had nowhere to go except back to the center. If the ruler died, if ministers manipulated succession, if court factions distorted the will of the throne, or if unrest spread through the empire, the whole system felt it immediately. A looser kingdom might bend. The Qin throne presided over a machine that was built to command, not to absorb shock. The stronger it looked, the less forgiving it became. That is what makes the Qin case feel so haunting. A throne like this does not become dangerous only because ambitious men gather around it. It becomes dangerous because whoever controls it temporarily controls everything, and that creates unbearable pressure the moment legitimacy is uncertain. The death of the founding ruler did not simply create a vacancy, it opened the most dangerous chamber in the empire. Ministers, heirs, officials, and conspirators were no longer negotiating over one palace office. They were fighting over the master switch of a newly unified world. In such an atmosphere, the throne becomes more than a seat. It becomes a point where fear, secrecy, and political manipulation can undo an empire faster than foreign invasion ever could. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become more dangerous than war because they concentrate success so completely that no imperfect succession can pass through them safely. That is why the Qin throne takes this place on the list. It reveals how an empire can conquer rivals in the open field, then discover that the true vulnerability lies in the deadly intimacy of the palace after victory has already been won. The battlefield unified the realm. The throne nearly destroyed it. Number 5, the Byzantine throne and the ritual of blinding power. Some thrones become dangerous because they are surrounded by assassination, poison, or dynastic war. The Byzantine throne is darker because it transformed the struggle for rule into something at once political, ceremonial, and horrifyingly physical. That is what makes the case so unsettling. In Byzantium, power was not only contested through armies and intrigue, it was also shaped by the logic that an emperor's body mattered symbolically, and that mutilation could become a calculated instrument of legitimacy. A throne in such a world is frightening because the struggle around it does not stop at removing rivals. It marks them, disables them, and turns the body itself into proof that power has changed hands. When a monarchy reaches that point, the palace no longer feels like the opposite of violence. It feels like violence ritualized. What gave the Byzantine throne its force also made it frightening. The empire inherited Roman ideas of majesty, imperial continuity, court ceremony, and sacred rulership, and that gave the throne enormous symbolic power. But the more exalted a throne becomes, the more dangerous it is when too many people believe that symbolic perfection matters to rule. If a claimant can be made physically unfit, if sight can be taken, if the body can be altered, so that the rival no longer appears capable of embodying imperial order, then court struggle becomes terrifyingly intimate. The throne is still the center of administration, diplomacy, and empire, but it is also surrounded by a logic in which political survival depends on what can be done to human flesh under imperial conditions. That is what makes the Byzantine case feel so heavy. Blinding is especially chilling because it sits between mercy and cruelty in a way that exposes how distorted palace politics can become. The rival is not always killed outright. He is rendered incapable, transformed into a living sign that he has been forced out of the circle of legitimate rule. That gives the throne a uniquely cold atmosphere. The danger is not only death. It is disfigurement turned into statecraft, punishment turned into political design. Anyone close to such a throne understands that losing the struggle may mean more than execution. It may mean surviving in a condition deliberately crafted to sever you forever from sovereignty. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadlier than battle because battle kills from a distance, while palace power learns how to reshape the body of the defeated into part of its own ritual grammar. That is why the Byzantine throne belongs so high on this list. It reveals a monarchy where the contest for supreme authority became inseparable from a chilling language of mutilation, legitimacy, and ceremonial domination. In that world, the throne is not just defended, it is enforced through the terrifying knowledge that the body of the loser may become the final argument for why the winner now rules. Number 4. The Persian throne and the deadly struggle of succession. Some thrones become dangerous because weak rulers cannot hold ambitious courts together. The Persian throne is darker because it belonged to one of the grandest imperial systems of the ancient world, a monarchy so vast, so symbolically charged, and so central to the order of empire that any uncertainty at the top could send danger rippling across entire continents. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The throne of the great king was not merely a seat in a palace. It was the political and ceremonial center of an imperial world stretching across many peoples, regions, and power structures. From the outside, that scale made the monarchy appear nearly unshakable. But the larger and richer such a throne becomes, the more deadly succession can be, because the prize is no longer one kingdom among many. It is the right to command an entire imperial universe. What gave the Persian throne its force also made it frightening. It drew immense authority into a single dynastic center. The great king stood not just as a ruler, but as the visible summit of imperial legitimacy, military command, and symbolic order. In such a system, succession cannot remain a minor family matter. If the transfer of power is contested, then nobles, courtiers, generals, provincial authorities, and royal kin all begin calculating at once. Every claimant becomes more dangerous because the throne is worth too much. Every delay becomes more perilous because the empire is too large to remain politically neutral while uncertainty spreads. A throne like this radiates stability when legitimacy is clear. But the moment legitimacy clouds, the same scale that once made the monarchy formidable begins magnifying the violence around it. That is what makes the Persian case feel so heavy. Succession in an empire of this kind is not only a matter of inheritance, it is a crisis of concentration. Too much authority depends on one recognized center, and once that center becomes contested, ambition moves rapidly from private tension to public danger. Rivalry at the top teaches the empire a terrible lesson. The throne that held everything together may itself become the source of disorder. Nobles choose sides. Court factions sharpen. Regional powers start reading uncertainty as opportunity. The monarchy remains magnificent, but magnificence does not protect the one who seeks to inherit it. It only raises the stakes of every move made around the crown. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become more dangerous than war because war can be fought at the edges, while succession threatens the center on which the whole imperial body depends. That is why the Persian throne takes this place on the list. It reveals how grandeur intensifies peril, turning the transfer of kingship into one of the most lethal moments an empire can endure. In such a world, the throne does not merely await an heir. It waits like a blade because everyone who approaches it understands that to possess the empire, one may first have to survive the empire's deadliest contest. Number 3. The Assyrian throne after great kings. Some thrones become dangerous because dynasties are weak from the beginning. The Assyrian throne is darker because it became especially lethal after periods of overwhelming success, when the empire had already taught the ancient world to fear its kings and then had to discover whether anyone after them could safely inherit the machine they had built. That is what makes the case so unsettling. A great king does not merely expand territory. He changes the scale of expectation around the throne itself. He makes rule look larger, harsher, more absolute, and more dependent on personal force of will. Once such a ruler is gone, the throne remains, but it remains burdened by the impossible question of who can occupy it without exposing how much of imperial stability had depended on one commanding figure. What gave the Assyrian throne its force also made it frightening. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was built on aggressive kingship, relentless campaigning, administrative reach, and the repeated display of terrifying royal power. That meant the throne did not symbolize passive continuity. It symbolized momentum, domination, and the expectation that the king would keep the empire's machinery moving with the same fierce clarity as his predecessors. Such a throne becomes deadly after great kings because succession now carries more than ordinary legitimacy. It carries comparison. Whoever follows must not only rule, he must prove that the center has lost none of its violence, confidence, or authority. And if that proof wavers, then court tension, dynastic weakness, and imperial uncertainty can spread with alarming speed. That is what makes the Assyrian case feel so haunting. A throne shaped by powerful rulers can become almost uninhabitable for lesser successors. The court knows what strong kings looked like. The army knows. The provinces know. The enemies know. Every hesitation at the top begins to matter more in a system trained to respond to ruthless command. After great kings, the danger is not simply that rivals appear. It is that the entire imperial structure begins testing whether the throne is still what it once was. If the answer is unclear, instability grows at the very point where absolute certainty had once been projected. The monarchy still possesses grandeur, but grandeur itself becomes a pressure that can crush the one trying to inherit it. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadlier than battle, because battle only asks a ruler to defeat enemies, while succession after greatness asks him to defeat comparison, expectation, and the memory of power at its most terrifying. That is why the Assyrian throne after great kings belongs so near the top of this list. It shows how an empire can become the victim of its own highest standard, turning the seat of rule into a place where inheritance is poisoned by the success of those who came before. In that world, the throne is not dangerous because it lacks power. It is dangerous because it contains too much accumulated power to pass from one ruler to the next without blood, fear, and the constant threat of collapse. Number 2. The Ptolemaic throne and the poison of sibling rule. Some thrones became dangerous because generals coveted them, ministers manipulated them, or empires made succession unstable. The Ptolemaic throne is darker because the danger was drawn into the family itself, until bloodline became one of the deadliest forces surrounding the crown. That is what makes the case so unsettling. In theory, dynastic marriage and shared royal blood were meant to preserve legitimacy, protect continuity, and keep power inside a sacred ruling house. But in the Ptolemaic world, that same logic helped create a monarchy in which brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, co-rulers, mothers and children could all become immediate threats to one another. The throne did not merely sit at the center of court politics. It sat inside a dynastic structure so tightly enclosed that intimacy itself became lethal. What gave the Ptolemaic throne its force also made it frightening. The dynasty drew authority from its control of Egypt, its Hellenistic royal identity, its wealth, its ceremonial image, and its insistence on dynastic legitimacy as something that had to remain visibly concentrated in the ruling family. That concentration gave the monarchy brilliance and symbolic force, but it also meant that every dispute over succession became unbearably personal. A rival was not always a distant noble or rebellious general. The rival might be the one sharing the palace, the marriage bed, or the same divine genealogy of kingship. Once rule depends so heavily on keeping legitimacy within the family stops being a refuge. It becomes the battlefield closest to the throne. That is what makes the Ptolemaic case feel so haunting. Sibling rule is especially dangerous because it creates the outward image of dynastic unity while storing rivalry at the very heart of sovereignty. Co-rule can look stable from the outside, but beneath that facade lies the constant question of who truly governs, who can be displaced, who commands the court, and who will survive the next turn in palace politics. In such a world, marriage and kinship do not soften the struggle for power. They intensify it, because every claim is wrapped in proximity, shared blood, and the impossible demand that the dynasty remain both united and supreme. The throne therefore becomes poisonous in a uniquely intimate way. It teaches everyone near it that family is not protection, when family itself is part of the machinery of rule. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become more dangerous than war because war places enemies at a distance, while dynastic kingship can place them at the royal table. That is why the Ptolemaic throne takes the number 2 place on this list. It reveals a monarchy in which the preservation of legitimacy through family closeness helped turn that family into one of the most dangerous environments a ruler could inhabit. In that sense, the throne was not merely surrounded by intrigue. It was fed by a dynastic arrangement that made affection uncertain, trust unstable, and succession so intimate that poison, betrayal, and political destruction could grow from the very bonds meant to protect the crown. Number 1. The Roman imperial throne and the logic of assassination. Some thrones became deadly because succession was contested, dynasties were fragile, or sacred kingship placed unbearable pressure on those who ruled. The Roman imperial throne is darker than almost any other because it seems to have absorbed assassination into the political logic of power itself. That is what makes the case so chilling. This was not simply a monarchy in which rulers occasionally met violent ends. It was a system in which the concentration of imperial authority, the absence of fully secure succession, the ambitions of armies, the calculations of elites, and the volatility of palace politics combined so repeatedly that the murder of emperors ceased to feel like an interruption of the system and began to look like one of the ways the system functioned. A throne in that condition is more dangerous than war, because war at least declares itself. Assassination lives beside the ruler every day. What gave the Roman imperial throne its force also made it frightening. The emperor stood at the center of military command, political legitimacy, public order, elite privilege, and the symbolic unity of the Roman world. That meant the throne carried incomparable power, but it also meant too many groups had reasons to fear the person occupying it, manipulate him, remove him, or replace him. Senators could resent. Guards could calculate. Generals could threaten. Armies could proclaim. Courtiers could whisper. Heirs could become liabilities before they became successors. The office was immense, yet the path into it was never stable enough to protect the one who held it. Once that condition hardens, the throne stops being a seat of secure rule and becomes a fatal point of convergence for every unresolved tension in the empire. That is what makes the Roman case feel so heavy. The emperor may command armies across continents, but the real danger often lies in the chamber behind him, the guard beside him, the court around him, or the political atmosphere that has already begun, deciding whether he should continue living. In such a world, assassination is not merely a private act of treachery. It becomes a political language. It says that authority can be ended if enough power gathers against it at close range. It teaches every ruler that visible majesty does not guarantee invisible loyalty. It teaches every observer that the empire's center is not protected from violence by its grandeur. It is targeted because of it. The throne remains the summit of Roman power, but it is also the place where power is most exposed to sudden, intimate destruction. The deeper lesson is that some thrones become deadlier than any battlefield because they turn supreme rule into permanent vulnerability. That is why the Roman imperial throne takes the number 1 place on this list. It captures the darkest truth running through all 10 of these cases. The closer authority comes to absolute concentration, the more likely it is to generate the fear, ambition, and hatred that make violent removal seem rational to those standing nearest it. In Rome, the throne did not simply attract power. It attracted the logic that power could be solved through murder. And once a political world learns that lesson deeply enough, the palace becomes more dangerous than the frontier, because the emperor may survive the enemy beyond the border, only to discover that the deadliest weapon in the empire was already inside the walls.